It's a beautiful day, and I am delighted to welcome you to a new episode of the Computational Antitrust Podcast. My name is Thibault Schrepel. I am a faculty affiliate at Stanford University Codex Center, an associate professor of law at the VU Amsterdam, and the creator of the Computational Antitrust Project, which explores how legal informatics can benefit antitrust law. The project brings together over 65 competition agencies and about 50 academics on the advisory board. Every month or so, we publish an academic article on the subject of computational antitrust. You can find all of these publications at computationalantitrust.com. Today, I am delighted to receive Philip Hanspach, now an economist at the Bundeskartellamt, and at the time he wrote the paper, an expert at the OECD. Philip wrote a paper for the project entitled Economics in the Era of Machine Learning. What do competition lawyers need to know? Philip, welcome, and how are you today?
Thank you, Thibault. Thank you for the kind introduction. So perhaps it's best to follow up right away, mentioning right, as you said, I wrote this kind of in between jobs. So this is a purely personal statement, the paper, not an official position of any employer. And I also have no conflict of interest to disclose with respect to the contents of the paper. But I'm very delighted to be here to talk a little bit about my research.
Which is a good disclaimer, but does not tell me how you are doing today.
Well, today's a pretty good day. It's a weekend. We're recording this on a Saturday, so I was able to sleep in long, get the household chores out of the way. So I have a very relaxed afternoon in front of me.
All right, very, very good. So now let's dive into your publication for us, and please start with a short summary of the key findings of your paper.
So the first thing I'm really trying to do in this paper is to compare econometric techniques with machine learning techniques, where, of course, you know that econometrics is the statistical and the mathematical tool set, in a sense, to analyze economic and social data. And machine learning is a relatively new tool for empirical economists dealing with these sort of data. And me as a competition economist, I have often been quite impressed by the effort that some competition lawyers have made to understand econometrics. And this paper should help lawyers who already have a fundamental grasp of what economists are doing to tell the forest from the trees and equip them, in a sense, with a basic understanding of why machine learning tools are different and when they can be helpful in the context of competition cases. But the paper is also trying to do a second thing, which is perhaps more similar to what most economics papers try to do, and that is to understand human behavior. Me as a microeconomist, I like to think about people's actions in terms of incentives and asymmetric information. And when it comes to data analysis and competition policy, no matter the tool, there are all sorts of potentially conflicting incentives. So you have the judges who want to decide their cases efficiently, correctly, and without exposing themselves. You have companies that want their lawyers and consultants to make the best possible argument for their case with the data they have. You have private consultants who want to show their technical chops to justify their high rates. And you have lawyers who want to win cases, of course. And not everyone in this arena has the statistical training to tell a good analysis from a badly made or biased one, so to say. And of course, this is not a new issue that is specific to machine learning, but this is something that experts have been discussing for a long time regarding the role of econometrics in competition law. So I'm also making a few arguments that go into this vein. I illustrate some strategies that a bad actor might choose to use the new tools to make a more convincing but flawed analysis. But I also make a perhaps somewhat sidetracked discussion of what changes for businesses or how the role of businesses in this whole universe changes. I say that big data plays a bigger role in large companies, and companies are more likely to have data-related expertise and well-structured data sets now compared to what they had in the past. So empirical evidence will become more common, I predict, And machine learning techniques will come up more often as evidence in cases because also companies might have interdisciplinary teams, right? So the data expert teams in a company might be staffed not necessarily with economists, but with data scientists or business graduates with machine learning and data analysis skills, but without a background in economics or econometrics. So traditional econometric tools might not even be their first port of call. So this sort of evidence based on machine learning will likely become more common. And finally, I make this perhaps a little bit outlandish argument that companies and competition economists will view the world through an increasingly more similar lens. For example, in the past, a company might have relied on intuition and experience to estimate economic relationships like switching rates or price elasticities. And I say now they might do the same analysis that industrial organization economists have been doing for decades. And in return, this could make decisions that were driven by these analyses more impactful. So in a way, I think reality might start to conform to theory because new data-driven tools that come from academia have made their way onto the desks of decision makers.
So in a sense, it's all about incentives, right? As to why you may want to use certain kind of evidence, whether they are produced by machine learning or not. So, and depending on whether you're a judge, a counsel in a company, a lawyer, of course you have different incentives, which may lead to the need or the desire to use different tools. But before we dive into that, I want to ask about your incentive in writing this paper. Was it that you have had conversations with competition lawyers and you realized, wait a minute, they may actually benefit from such a paper? Or was it that you were having discussions or doing research when it comes to the economic side and thought, well, I think lawyers may like to read about that? What, again, triggered the need and the desire for you to write this paper in the first place?
That's a good question. I indeed had some discussions with competition lawyers about the need for economists to clearly communicate their methods to lawyers, not just specifically related to machine learning, but about economics methods in general. Because economists have this statistical training that allows them to have a somewhat different worldview where they're very comfortable, for example, dealing with uncertainty, while lawyers see it as a potential fault of any analysis, while the economist would say, well, there's uncertainty in everything. So I think it's important to emphasize and to explain why economists believe their methods are beneficial and useful, even if they come with the inherent uncertainty that's embedded in the world. Of course, this is also perhaps to preempt some cynicism regarding economists' motivations, because I certainly encountered that attitude from time to time with some people believing that economists align with the interests of whoever pays them. I read a lot of bad faith discussions about around the time of the failed appointment of Fiona Scott-Morton at the European Commission as chief competition economist. So I think it is useful also for lawyers to have perhaps a view from an economist side, them discussing, also honestly discussing and admitting limitations of the methods they use, but explaining and defending and justifying them. Also because I feel sometimes there is a received wisdom that economists can produce any desired outcome if they wish, which is something that I don't fully agree with, but I can kind of understand why some people believe it based on like the very, very limited insight that they get from the discussions that happen in litigation. And finally, of course, there's an increased interest in machine learning specifically among competition lawyers, even though personal discussions on the technical issues have been very limited. But of course, you have topics like algorithmic pricing that have become more important in competition law, which made a lot of lawyers also just curious about the new technological tools that are around. You've had competition agencies enhancing their empirical capabilities by hiring experts in data analysis and building up specialized teams for a couple of years now. And of course, you have economics consultancies that are increasingly advertising their machine learning expertise as part of their portfolio. And I have a couple of examples of that in the paper, which I think serve as a really neat motivation why this is useful to discuss.
Yeah, very much so. Let me just two quick reactions to what you just said. First, this idea that economists can produce any kind of evidence as long as they are getting paid. You see that sometimes people have the same feeling when it comes to lawyers, right? And especially if they are not aware of the way it works. So you would hear that in criminal cases, a lawyer defending a potential client would always argue for non-guilty, but in fact lawyers are very much bounded by the fact of the case, and they will sure defend their clients, but again within the range of what is possible given the facts that are presented to the court. The second reaction is, you mentioned Fiona Scott Morton and this idea that because she one day consulted for some companies, she would be for the rest of eternity completely bought in and would have changed her mind to such a degree that she will be incapable of producing any kind of serious economic evidence. I mean, again, this is not knowing the way it works. Academics have papers sometimes for years, and it's not as if they would just suddenly switch their mind just because they consulted for some companies, right? There are a couple examples, but Fiona was certainly not one of those. So those are very good points. Now, diving into the substance of the paper, and this will be part one of our conversation, you do have a section entitled Separating Substance from Hype, which is more than necessary, especially nowadays when it comes to AI and machine learning. So to get it started, in just a couple words, what is substance and what is hype in the space?
Yeah, thank you. So in a few words, really, substance in machine learning for me is about finding use cases that genuinely enhance what we can achieve with traditional econometric models. Right? I give a couple of examples of economists using machine learning extensively in research and analysis, especially where prediction is the main goal. And we have a lot of use for good prediction models in competition policy. There's a couple of situations where we want a good prediction. We want to predict what prices would be after a merger. We want to predict, or not just forecast, but sometimes also backcast counterfactual prices to understand what would prices in a marketplace have looked like without a cartel or without an abusive practice by a dominant firm. So in terms of substance, there are a couple of predictive models that advanced machine learning models offer. So if we start very simple from a well-known linear regression, you could have the Lasso model, which just adds a penalty for adding extra variables to simplify models. But if we look into more advanced models, we have decision trees, support vector machines, and neural networks that, in terms of substance, they add the better capability to detect nonlinear effects and interactions that allow an analyst to uncover relationships that a simple linear model might overlook. But in terms of the hype, of course, there's a lot of limitations to using these models in practice. First and foremost, very high data demands, right? Acquiring the vast and detailed data sets can be challenging, especially if the data that you need is held by the opposing party in a legal dispute. And when data lacks sufficient variation, machine learning methods may not be practical or may yield unreliable results, which again is not totally different from what we have in econometrics. For example, in my experience, a long time ago, I worked on a case with historical transaction data for a food item where prices were renegotiated between the manufacturer and the retailer on an annual basis. So even with 15 years of data, which was pretty good, the variation that we had in the data was quite limited. So a machine learning tool would not add much value. Knowing when to cut losses, when to step back and say, okay, this is not the right tool for this job, is essential. And also there's a certain risk of analyst bias, even when machine learning optimizes its models through a data-driven selection rather than an analyst-designed bespoke formula. There's still room for bias and the possibility for a creative analyst, given time, to at least guide a model towards specific outcomes, right? Even if, like you mentioned, an analyst is still bound by the facts of the case, impartiality and transparency in the modeling process are still crucial to get an unbiased result.
So, in a sense, hype is, or would be, it would be the belief that you could actually predict the future with 100% certainty because you do run a machine learning system with some database, right? When in fact, as you said, it could be biases will be part of it. Of course, you always have the black swans. It could be that you don't have enough data. It's not of good quality. So if we put that aside and just focus for the moment on the substance, so where indeed machine learning could make sense in competition cases. Now, I would like you to tell us about some of the advantages and the limitations that machine learning techniques would have compared to traditional econometrics. And so maybe we could start with the advantages of using machine learning instead of econometrics.
Sure. So the biggest difference, in a sense, of course, or the thing that's perhaps most appealing to an econometrician using these methods for the first time is the data-driven model selection. So machine learning makes it easier for an economist to determine what is the best predictive model, for instance, to forecast car prices in a given market based solely on the available data. And also, another thing that I already hinted at is the identification of nonlinear and complex relationships. Because machine learning is less model-based, it works on fewer assumptions than a traditional econometric model. It can help uncover patterns and relationships that are nonlinear or complex, which I know complexity is a topic that you're very much invested in, and one that traditional econometric models may miss. Now, I've talked a lot about prediction, but at least as a side note, I want to mention that causality in machine learning is also something that researchers have been making a lot of progress on in recent years. So I don't want to exclude that. I just wanted to throw that out there. So, but those are the two main advantages that I want to put forward.
Yeah. That reminds me of a keynote that Susan Athey, at the time she was the chief economist of the DOJ, she delivered in our annual conference last year, in which she said that indeed one of the big advantage that she was seeing in using machine learning within the DOJ antitrust division was that she had to intervene less in producing an output and a result than if she were to use econometrics. And so this would give less opportunities to judges and courts, if the decisions were appealed, to ask, for the reasons why she intervened in such a way. Now, of course, machine learning is not magical, and it's not that you may want to use it in all of the cases, and econometrics is of no use today because there are some limitations. So can you please take us through now some of those main limitations?
Yeah, so one of the limitations that are already hinted in are the high data requirements. And to elaborate a little bit more on why does a machine learning model typically need so much more data than a traditional linear regression model in econometrics? It is due to the flexibility of the form of the final model in a machine learning case that's really able to capture very intricate patterns, but that also requires extensive data to avoid overfitting. So that means to avoid just modeling according to the noise. And there's a huge volume of parameters. Machine learning models often have many more parameters to optimize than classic linear models. And because machine learning models often don't assume a specific functional relationship, which in econometrics would be expressed in a regression equation, the machine learning model will need additional data to guide its process instead. You have this so-called curse of dimensionality, where if you engineer more and more features, the data that you need grows exponentially to keep the quality of the estimation constant. You also have some techniques that are specific to machine learning rather than econometrics, like cross-validation, where you split data into multiple sets, which means that there's less data available per model iteration. because you just train the model on a subset of your data. So this means initially you need a much bigger data set as well. And finally, I already mentioned that there's this bias and variance trade-off, which basically is all about balancing the model complexity with the model performance, which demands larger data sets so that you even have a useful trade-off to begin with. But a different disadvantage, a different limitation would be sometimes low explainability of a machine learning model. And again, this is something that's being worked on, question of explainable AI and algorithmic audit, that's all out there. There's all researchers working on that. But in principle, a machine learning model doesn't have to align with economic theory. It may identify relationships in the data that weren't hypothesized initially. And while this can improve predictive accuracy, it makes it harder to interpret why the model behaves in the way it does. In contrast, traditional econometrics would start with a theory. It would propose a relationship between different variables based on an economic rationale, and then uses regression to validate this theory, which offers a more transparent explanation, but of course has its own drawbacks, right? There's no silver bullet solving all the problems at once.
Yeah, one quick reaction and a follow-up question. My reaction is this: when it comes to explainable AI, this is where lawyers will enter the room and may say that if you make your AI system truly explainable, it might be that in explaining how the system, quote unquote, reached a decision, it will actually disclose some data that may be personal, right? In saying, well, I used this data coming from these data sets, and this may be an infringement to GDPR. So this is where the interplay between the work of economists and lawyers is I think, more than needed. My follow-up question is this: amongst all of those limitations, it seems to me that most of them will actually be fixed in a sense in the coming years, right? If the cost decreases and if we indeed perform better, do you see some limitation that is fundamental and will never be addressed, regardless of the state of compute and the costs and research?
I think the quality of data that is actually collected by companies and statistical agencies will remain a significant limitation, because even if we think of it as very cheap to store massive amounts of data and to collect data, I think a lot of companies don't really have this on their radar, that this can be very beneficial in a pinch to have long data sets going back many years. And especially if you move away from the biggest and most professionally organized firms, you'll see a lot of companies have a massive skills gap and also not really the incentive to really invest in these capabilities. So I think for many years to come, we will have cases where there could be an interesting analysis to be made, but the relevant data will simply not be available.
Okay, so if we indeed face such limitations, at least for a couple years ahead of us, it means that machine learning is not always the way to go. Now, my question is, do you think it would be possible maybe today or tomorrow to develop guidelines as to when companies and courts and in-house counsels and all the parties you've mentioned in the introduction would use econometrics versus machine learning instead of, having some cherry picking where you will run both analysis and actually just give to courts the one that is more convenient for the sake of making your argument? Are we here in terms of drafting some guidelines, or do you think it's something that is impossible regarding the state of knowledge today?
So this is just my own personal opinion, but I believe that, at least my intuition would be that generally both traditional methods and new tools will often reach similar conclusions. So I wouldn't want to overly generalize when to choose one method over the other. In a way, if that wasn't the case, and we would get very different outcomes to a case depending on whether we use a traditional econometric model or a machine learning model, I would probably be even more concerned. So I discuss a little bit the guidelines that are around for econometric and empirical evidence in the paper. And what I find there is that agencies have a lot of discretion in what methods they use. And I think this is a good thing. Courts tend to allow authorities a good deal of discretion in how they approach cases. And I think this is definitely an instance where it's beneficial to maintain a flexible approach. Also, because existing guidelines are very method neutral, I don't think there's an urgent need to change this. So I wouldn't want to dictate specific tools for specific circumstances, but rather keep emphasizing the use of state-of-the-art techniques and quality measures that align with academic best practices. And it would be valuable, however, to have guidelines that explain to courts and lawyers what quality measures are. Like how does an academic evaluate the quality of their econometric model, and why they're important, why they might not be important, right? Maybe some people hear about one thing, they learn about one thing, and then they're always onto that. I've seen this a lot of people who get really obsessed once they understand a little bit what R square means, and they always look, what's the R square in this regression? And they might not understand that sometimes R square can be very low, but the model might still be very good at identifying a specific effect, what it's looking for. So maybe having a bit more of a discussion what makes the quality of a machine learning based analysis could be useful. On the other hand, one different argument that I'm making in the paper is that companies, when they start using more interdisciplinary teams for data analysis, they could benefit from guidelines that also clarify the standards of professional economic analysis, because that could help avoid confusion about expectations and standards in the context where a company submits an analysis, and their business graduates who worked on this might be very surprised that economists expect to read something very different. But this is really about clarifying and explaining reader expectations for these sorts of empirical analysis.
Yeah. Okay, so guidelines for quality, but not necessarily for telling when to use econometrics versus machine learning. And I suppose if an agency uses one of those two techniques and the parties use the other one and then go before the court, it will very much depend on the culture at the court, right? I would see how in some jurisdictions the use of machine learning would be discarded as being, too hard to comprehend, and in other jurisdictions, I could see the exact opposite effect, where the judge would be very much impressed because it is AI based. But coming back to what you mentioned, and this would be part two of our conversation, looking at the more practical aspect. So you do mention the need for quality guidelines as a way to help at least courts, and why not agencies as well. And you do list questions that practitioners could indeed ask to evaluate whether machine learning is robust in specific cases. I just give a couple examples. You said that it may be worth asking whether some potential overfitting has been addressed, if cross-validation techniques were used to validate the results, etc., etc. Now, I am concerned that judges may not systematically ask those questions when the decisions are being challenged. I think if they are to ask the question, of course, judges can't be expected to have the knowledge to answer the question, but they could definitely hire experts and get to an answer. But the willingness to ask the question in the first place, I think, is a big, big challenge. So how do you see this working in practice?
Yeah, so I definitely think that understanding empirical data analysis today requires a lot more in-depth knowledge than it did even 5 or 10 years ago, especially if we have this rise of machine learning in legal and economic contexts. So I agree with you that there will probably be a greater role for court-appointed experts who can assess studies that rely on machine learning techniques. And perhaps that will even cross-examine economists on these matters in court, something that is not so common in Europe nowadays. And the expertise of these external experts that could come from academia, for example, could guide judges in evaluating complex evidence. But more broadly, I think this is also about building lawyer expertise. Lawyers who hire economic consultants may need to develop their own understanding of machine learning models to critically assess these analyses before they are presented in court. And I think this is perhaps not totally unrealistic because some lawyers are already doing this with traditional econometric models. Some of them are very much up to speed on these methods and can very critically assess what their hired economists are doing. So there's all this, and my prediction is that eventually we will see a high-profile case in Europe where machine learning-driven analysis will take center stage. And as you said, there will be a precedent set depending on what court it is, and depending on the judge's ability to understand and appraise machine learning as evidence. If well handled, it could become it could become a foundation for future machine learning based cases. And I hope that this paper can also be a timely contribution in this context, helping to ensure that courts approach machine learning evidence with an open mind, but also with a well-informed and balanced perspective that helps to set a good precedent.
Yeah. On that, I am very pleased to see that some judges of the General Court and the Court of Justice are subscribing to our newsletter and sometimes react to our publications. So I'm confident that if such cases go to them, they will know how to address, and they will give us, the beautiful little paragraphs and provisions we will want to see in such decisions. But for now, looking at 2024, do you have in mind some real world examples where machine learning has been used in competition law cases and has greatly benefited the analysis?
So yeah, these courses, of course, are very hard to find, which leaves the whole discussion sometimes a bit theoretical or a bit up in the air. As a student, I tried using text analysis on a large data set of competition law cases just to explore generally how economic analysis influenced these decisions. And at least in Germany, on which I was working, public access to really detailed decisions was limited, which made it really hard to get in-depth insights, at least on German cases, just generally what was the role of economic analysis. But I did come across some useful examples of machine learning being used in competition policy, like a 2023 paper by some FTC economists in the Review of Industrial Organization that discussed machine learning's role in estimating spatial demand for healthcare. So this was definitely a building block and some sort of analysis that they did. But beyond this, I think there's a subtle but very essential role to machine learning, not in the form of big damages models or counterfactual predictions. But consider that we rely on AI and machine learning in consumer tech all the time without realizing it. And competition lawyers also use machine learning in very foundational ways that may not always make headlines, but that are very crucial in handling vast and complex data sets. So, for example, if you think about the European trucks cartel case, there were thousands of invoices involved. People didn't type them all up manually, but they would use, for example, OCR software to read out these invoices on paper. And of course, that's a machine learning based tool that helps reading and processing these documents, and which really makes it feasible to bring these cases to court in the first place. And of course, then you have similar questions of what's the validity and reliability of these methods. It's, in a sense, of course, also a very different issue from using models to model counterfactual economic scenarios, but it's definitely the case that machine learning is here to stay in competition law as it is in our everyday life.
Yeah. I have three quick reactions, and feel free to react to my reactions. The first one, you've mentioned the defining of market or the use of machine learning to define, spatial market or demand or consumer surplus. I know that the competition agency in Canada is also very much involved in that. So this is coming. Reaction number two, in our annual reports, what we've seen is that machine learning was not at all on the map even 2-3 years ago as to what competition agencies are doing. And in our annual report that we published last year, so actually in June of this year, but covering what agencies have been doing in 2023, we see that for the first time, some agencies are engaging in machine learning. So indeed, it will take time for them to come up with decisions, disclosing how they use machine learning, but it's certainly coming. And my reaction number 3, you've mentioned the fact that indeed, increasingly we are relying on some tools that in the backend are using some machine learning techniques. And I'm reminded sometimes of what we see in academic discussions in which some people say, well, you can't actually use AI for the purpose of doing research. And increasingly, I think it will become extremely hard not to produce research that has touched AI to the slightest, because it's not, of course, you can use ChatGPT, in which case it's very obvious, but it may also be that you are using some softwares that are relying on AI and you're not even aware of it. So machine learning, as you just explained, will and could be everywhere. And actually, in 100% of all the cases, we will see before competition agencies one way or the other. That leads me to a final question. You, in the paper, provide with an example as to how useful it might be to competition lawyers to use machine learning. So could you tell us a bit more about that example?
Yeah, I mean, first to react to what you said, that this is super interesting. I wasn't aware of the results of your latest annual report, but it makes a lot of sense to me because there's just a natural lack of things filtering through to practice. And as from my time in academia, of course, I'm used to things taking years to get published, and some results taking a really long time to appear from the desk of a state-of-the-art researcher, even to the public face, to a published working paper. So I'm not surprised that when it comes to public authorities and court cases, it just may take a long time, which might be very frustrating for people who are always interested in the cutting edge. But well, change happens, just happens slowly. But to get to your question on the practical example, yeah, I included a little toy model in the paper. And I think this is always fun for readers, perhaps more to give readers a practical and illustrative example that brings theory to life and to help them see a complex idea in action. So I wanted to showcase how machine learning can accomplish tasks that traditional econometric methods struggle with, like text classification using natural language processing. And I also give an example that's perhaps more on the procedural side, how to do something rather than how to predict some very complex economic relationship. So what I did was I used ChatGPT to generate a set of fake corporate emails. Some emails were like business routine, while others contained subtle hints of collusion, inviting competitors to join a cartel. And then the exercise is really to use an NLP algorithm, so natural language processing, to classify these emails into categories and to identify those which might contain suspicious content. So then I tried to simulate an encryption strategy to make things more challenging. I quote unquote encrypted the collusive emails by replacing incriminating words with innocent sounding codes. So I would transform an invitation to a cartel into something like an invitation to a pizza party. And then to see, despite the disguise, the model could still differentiate between the collusive and non-collusive emails, because it could still pick up on different general sentence structure between that and internal email, which is supposed to show the robustness of natural language processing for detecting patterns, even with altered language. And I think this could be useful for readers because it illustrates some real-world relevance. And I share the notebook. There are links in the paper, so readers can experiment and see firsthand how it works, even with standard libraries. So if you want to play around with this, that's an option.
Yeah, I think it is super useful, especially given how nuanced the paper is, to finish on, despite all the nuances, or maybe not despite, but considering all of that, here is what is possible for you today. without training in machine learning necessarily, I think it's extremely valuable indeed. You mentioned the word pizza. Usually, when I hear that, I'm locked in for the rest of the day, and this is what I have to eat. But I'm cooking a bœuf bourguignon today, so I'm
Oh,
safe.
nice.
Let me ask a final bonus question. So we are recording that early November, so Halloween just is behind us. So if you haven't watched the movie The Substance, you've missed the train.
Hmm.
Could you give us a good movie to watch for the depressing month of November?
So right now I'm kind of like rewatching old James Bond movies. So I think I'm not with the super old ones right now, but I think rewatching the Daniel Craig ones is quite worthwhile and probably underrated. So I would invite every viewer to go back to Casino Royale and see how it held up. I think it holds up pretty well compared to most modern action movies, and we haven't had a James Bond movie in such a long time.
That's fair. All right, I'll try to do that in the next coming days. I haven't watched this movie in a very long time. So, thank you so much again for the paper. Looking at the first reactions after publication, it seems there is a huge interest in the space. So, I'm so pleased that you had this idea for the paper and of the final outcome. I hope you are too. I hope you enjoy your time at the Bundeskartellamt. I'll see you there, I'm sure, sometimes in the coming month. And to everyone out there, take care of yourself, and if you can, someone else too. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.